Hey Lydia, thank you for joining me today to discuss workplace flexibility. More than 70% of fundraisers in nonprofits are women, and women certainly have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And in many ways, the pandemic has brought to light the importance of a lot of things, including workplace flexibility. So as we start this discussion on that topic with a lens towards nonprofits, I would love to hear a little of your personal history and why workplace flexibility is important to you.
Absolutely. I actually have been working in nonprofits a little over 20 years now, which makes me older than I want to think about. But as I, as part of Generation X, I guess, flexibility in the workplace, I think, was not something that we were used to when we first entered the workforce. And I happened to be both lucky and unlucky in that in my first job in nonprofit, my parents became extremely ill. In fact, my father died within about 2 years after I took my first job. Or I'm sorry, my mother died within about 2 years after I took my first job. And my father followed her about 3 years later. They lived about 500 miles away. And I remember just being stuck with just overwhelmed by how am I going to manage. I had this job that I've only had for a couple of years. I was in my late 20s. Just really not sure how I was going to manage it all, having to figure out what to do with them 500 miles away. And my boss at that time said to me, we'll figure it out. And he worked with me. And that was in an era where we didn't have Zoom. They had just started making email accessible over the internet. And so there were no virtual private networks. There was no way to log on to the work network. And really, we had to set up a series of projects I would take with me and a series of check-ins that I would do so that we knew what was happening and still give me the flexibility to be able to take care of my parents. I had about a 6-month period where I had to travel that 500-mile distance back and forth every other week because they needed someone there to manage their care. And it was both of them. They were both needing 24-hour care. If I hadn't had that flexibility from my boss, I'm not sure where I'd be today. And I will never, and this boss knows who they are, I will never be able to repay the debt that he did for me, because it really allowed me to continue to focus moving forward on my career, but at the same time, take care of the things that I needed to take care of at home. I will carry those lessons with me forever. And I will always, as I lead teams, I carry that with me and I remember that. And so certainly as I have had the opportunity to lead teams since then, we're people, we have families, we have lives outside of the office. We have to be given the grace and the time and the flexibility to take care of those things, because that's what creates loyal team members. It's what creates that work-life balance, that self-care that we want to encourage our team members to have. And me making demands on somebody when they only have so much to give is not fair.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's, clearly you have seen it at play in the importance of flexibility and that loyalty. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you've kind of led with grace at Home of the Innocents and the impact that you've seen that make.
Sure. Well, I have a team that runs the gamut of, I've got people in their early 20s and I've got people in their 60s on my team. And everything in between. And so we've got lots of phases of life going on my team. And through the years, so I've been at Home of the Innocents for about 6.5 years. So I've seen a lot of people come and go, and I've seen a lot of people through various stages of their lives. I have one team member who several years ago now, she got pregnant and was having twins. We were all very excited for her. But it was a rough pregnancy for her, and she ended up needing bed rest for the last month of her pregnancy. And at that time, we had very different leadership than we had now. I really had to fight to make sure that she could work from the hospital when she was on bed rest. She was in the hospital for the last month of her pregnancy. There was some question about whether that would count as her maternity leave. And I just felt really strongly the work that she does for us is work that can be done anywhere. At this point, we did have the ability for her to log into the network. Emails much, is only a piece of things. And we had very specific projects with very specific deadlines that we knew we could track her progress through for that time. And we were able to make it work. And so she was able to continue to work. She had tons of time on her hands in the hospital on bed rest. And she still managed to have a really nice full maternity leave with her children when they got home. And what that has helped produce is we didn't lose a valuable employee who is ingrained in our culture, who knows our mission. If anything, we helped strengthen her loyalty to the organization. And it's the kind of retention that you want to have, I think, with your team members.
Amen. And especially in this field where turnover and burnout are so high.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What we do, our missions, and especially with an organization like Home of the Innocents, our missions are so draining. We see people, we hear, and granted, fundraisers aren't doing the direct care. We know that. But we still are often seeing clients, working with their case managers and their clinicians. We are seeing the direct effects of the trauma on the kids. As I walk down hallways, I see what happens to these kids. I see the results of what's happened. I see the hurt and the pain. Those are hard things to carry. And those of us who aren't trained in being a clinician, it can be even more difficult. So we already have that piece. And then on top of it, we're constantly trying to convince people to invest in our missions. And that is something that has no end. So, we talk about that fiscal year and getting to the end of that fiscal year, and you've got like 30 seconds to go, yes, we did it. All right, now we got to start at zero again. And it can be extremely stressful. It's extremely, you can be given to burnout really quickly. And if we're not, nonprofits will never be able to give huge bonuses, and we'll never have stock options, and we'll never have some of those financial benefits that a lot of the for-profits have. But what we can have is compassion. And what we can have is the grace to give people the time, the flexibility, and the space they need to balance their lives. And that, I think, is extremely powerful.
Amen. And I think one thing that, study after study says that people can be more productive when given flexibility. And I know you all have seen that with, maybe even more flexibility than ever this last year with the pandemic. You all had a really successful year. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So we have 2 residential programs at the home. One's a long-term care facility for children, and then one is our out-of-home congregate care setting. And then we've got various programs with clinicians who see their clients in their homes. So we didn't have the luxury of closing our doors, nor do we have the majority of our staff has to be on campus because that's where the kids are and that's where their jobs are. The parts of the organization I oversee are things like our communications function, our fundraising and development and grants teams, our outreach teams with our volunteers and our non-monetary donations, as well as some strategic planning and advocacy and stuff like that. All of those functions can be done from anywhere. And we had been experimenting with flexible work schedules before the pandemic hit. But the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden we had about 20% of our staff that we had to say work from home because we needed to keep the campus as locked down as possible for the kids who were going to be here. We had no idea what COVID would do to the kids. We needed to keep the team members safe so they weren't bringing it to the kids. We've got 76 kids who are medically complex. We had no clue what kind of havoc this virus would wreak on them. So anybody who could work from home, we asked to work from home. And what we found a few things. one, a lot of people ended up working more hours from home than they did from the office. And so, and I know I was guilty of that too. It was like this, we couldn't be on campus, we couldn't be with our teams. So overcompensated, and 10, 11, 12-hour days were normal for all of us. And I think we all had to kind of get to a point where we were able to set boundaries for ourselves. But everybody was more productive. So even the hours they did work, even when we were able to start putting those guardrails in place for ourselves, we've raised more money. We've gotten more communications done. We've been able to create virtual volunteer opportunities and become creative in ways that we never thought we would. And we're not unique in that. I'm sure every nonprofit has had to stretch and do things very differently. But the upside, if there is one, to the pandemic is that it really helped us see what's possible when we take off that this is the way we've always done things lens, and we're forced to do things differently. And we're not intending to go back to the way things were. I think there's always going to be this hybrid element of some days you work from home, some days you work in the office. How can we create things and do things really different? And I think we've got a better understanding of what that looks like now.
That's what I was just going to ask you, as people start to fill their calendars a little bit more, as they're getting vaccinated and thinking about what it looks like to get back to the workplace, how can we not automatically go back to the way it was? And I love that you all are being very open-minded about that. I mean, do you have any advice for employers and employees as they start to have these conversations?
I guess I would just say that there are so many innovative lessons that the last year has taught us. And I think we would be really myopic to ignore those. So I would really encourage employers to look at the successes that you've had. And also to take into account what's happening with your team members. I've got a lot of team members now who still are having trouble finding childcare, or whose children still are not back in school every day. Those things have to be taken into consideration. I can't just all of a sudden turn around and say, all right, you're back full time next week, good luck. That's not going to work. Our lives have changed dramatically in the last year, personally and professionally, and that's everybody on a global scale. So I think, just really paying attention to those lessons, those positive experiences that we have had, and in being willing to move forward with those lessons, I think is important.
That's great. And you and I discussed this a while back, and I'd love for you to touch on it again. Like, what does it look like in example A, if you're already employed somewhere and you want to start having a conversation in the next year about, I really need this kind of flexibility, or option B, you're applying for a job and you want to have that conversation. So what advice do you have?
I think if you're working for a company, there are some jobs that you just can't be flexible. If you're a nurse, you can't provide nursing care from home. You just can't do it unless you're a visiting nurse and you're doing home care, but it's not your home. So, I think understanding what your job duties are and what your job responsibilities are is one thing. So if you're trying to be, there are other ways that a company can be flexible within those positions. Maybe it's, helping people find someone to cover shifts for them. I don't know. There are other ways of flexibility in those positions. Since I don't work one of those positions, it's harder for me to imagine what that would be, but there are ways. For positions like the ones that I manage, which are, fundraising positions, let's stick to the fundraising positions. I think if you work for a company that doesn't offer flexibility now, I think if you can sit down with your supervisor and lay out what working from home could look like. So I think it always helps if you can, and we do this with our solicitations and our grant applications and our asks, paint as complete a picture as you can of what you're asking for. So if what you want is to work from home 2 days a week, go to your supervisor with a proposal of what those 2 days a week will look like. How are you going to hold yourself accountable for the things that you're supposed to be working on? What kind of communication system do you want to set up with your supervisor to ensure that you're reporting what you're doing? What kinds of projects are you going to be working on? Now, in this COVID environment, we didn't have time to do any of that. So it really truly became the results will show what you're doing. And I've got an amazing team. So there's not a single member of my team that I question what they're doing. But I think if you can show that up front, and then I think if you're looking for a job and you want to make sure that you can negotiate that flexibility into the position, again, understand the position. If you're looking for a job of direct care in a facility, obviously that's not going to be there. But if you've got a support position that can be done from another location, when you get to that stage of the interview process, I would negotiate that in. Ask questions about the culture of the organization. Ask questions about their views towards flexibility. Everybody should have that opportunity at the end of a job interview to ask those questions. And your job interview, I would encourage anybody, when you go to a job interview, you are interviewing the company as much as the company is interviewing you. The fit's got to work both ways. And if you know that you don't want to work in a rigid culture where micromanagement and rules are going to be the thing that you have to contend with, find that out. Talk to them about what their expectations are. Yeah.
What comes to mind too is there's so many, just in Louisville right now, so many executive director positions, searches going on. And I can't help but wonder, shouldn't that be a question that's asked when they're hiring the top leadership these days, that the board should ask, like, what's your take on culture? What's your take on flexibility? Because it kind of, in a lot of ways, starts at the top. So that's a big thing to me, like educating the boards to ask those questions, right?
Absolutely. So, I'm lucky in that I work in an organization where the board and the executive leaders work very closely together. We're just coming off of our latest strategic planning process. So I love that as executive leaders, we know exactly what direction the board wants to go in, and we are all in alignment on where we're heading and how we want to get there. And it's a beautiful thing. So everything feels really good. Not every organization has that great working relationship between the executive and the board. But yes, I do think boards need to be very clear. Couple of things. Boards need to be very clear on their function, which is governance, not management. So that's number one. I think boards also need to be very clear on the fact that when they're choosing the executive leader, whether it's an executive director or a CEO, they are choosing the person who's going to set that culture and set that tone for the organization. They need to be comfortable with what that is. So I would encourage any board who's in the middle of the search to make sure they understand what culture it is that they're wanting to see implemented within the organization or not. I mean, there's a lot there that has to happen. Yeah.
No, that's really offering such great advice. And I know this is going on to a bit of a different topic, but I also think, and I was reading about the turnover rate and the burnout rate in this profession. And one of the biggest pieces is that a lot of fundraisers feel like they have expectations put on them that are not realistic.
Right.
So, I think it's hard for an employee to come to a boss and say, I really think that these are unrealistic, because then they feel like they're failing in some way, and that possibly the employer has no idea what's realistic. So, like, how do we have that conversation?
So that's a really good question. And I think one of the biggest issues that a lot of fundraisers face, because there's always that expectation, I think we all hear, oh, well, just go raise the money. Like it's a spigot we can turn on and off. Like it's just this easy thing we can do. If it were that easy, they wouldn't need us, right? I think And again, I feel like I'm spoiled at the home. I've really been able to set a lot of the tone for the fundraising department. I feel very strongly that creating a monetary goal for a fundraiser and holding them to that is not effective. And the reason I feel that way is because you can work just as hard to hear a no as you can to hear a yes. And once we have cultivated the relationship, whether it's through a grant funder or a company or an individual donor, and we are at that point where we're ready to make the ask, it's really out of our hands, right? I mean, there's only so much you can do to close the gift. And at the end of the day, the donor is going to make that decision. So to me, what's more important is ensuring that we're doing the right activities and that we're holding ourselves accountable to the activities that we're doing and that we're measuring those activities. So for us, we ended up doing a lot of education with our board. So when I first started, the board had this very traditional view of fundraising and, oh, if we want the money, just go send Lydia out and she'll raise it and that'll be great. And we really did have an education process where we brought in Jeff Ashley and Mark Roundtree, and Ashley Roundtree did some, they did a full assessment of our fundraising practices and policies and procedures and gave us some recommendations on what we could do to elevate our fundraising. And that really gave the board kind of an opportunity to stand back and look at what we were suggesting versus what we were doing. And then we were able to do some board training with them to help them understand. And what we do here is we try to foster a culture of philanthropy. So we're really trying to be very relational, not transactional in our fundraising. And it's been a process, but the board is starting to really understand why dollars in is not the metric that we really need to be paying attention to. If we're paying attention to more important metrics like donor retention, like average gift size, like the number of cultivation meetings we're able to have with donors, those dollars raised are going to go up. And we're seeing they're seeing the results of that as we've been able to at least double our fundraising since I walked in the door. And it's not awesome. It is not all me by any means. A great team that really does the work. We've just been able to set the tone.
I think that's wonderful. Like it really is a mindset change in a lot of ways. But once you lose, like if it isn't a realistic expectation and the employee leaves, I've seen a figure, I mean, it's a figure of your financial loss losing that employee and those relationships and all that's been built up. And so it's worth it to invest in that. And I love that you all have.
We really try to look at things.
Anything else? Go ahead.
I think it's really important to look at things in terms of your long-term goal. So not just looking at what we need immediately, but how are we get to where we want to be down the road. And all of that work, all that ground you lay now, you see the benefits of down the road. I would just encourage people to continue looking forward.
Yeah, amen. Such good advice, Lydia. Is there anything else you want to add in that we haven't touched on yet?
I don't think so. No, I think those are great questions. So, yeah.
Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much.